Wow.
Okay, folks, we're just going to give it a few more minutes to let people join, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we're going to see up to 40 people total here, so I'm sure more will trickle in, but let's get started. Welcome to Farm Succession, Future Farmers and Securing the Working Landscape. I'm Lydia Pitkin with the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, and I'd like to introduce your facilitator, Sam Smith of the Intervale Center. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to just run through some quick expectations in terms of Zoom etiquette for this. This is a Zoom meeting rather than a Zoom webinar like we were just in for the plenary. If you could please make sure that your Zoom name reflects your first and last name and your place of work, that would be great. Please remain muted unless called upon or engaging in breakout room conversation. You can use the raise hand feature in order to get our attention and get called on for contribution. Please do not interrupt. Please come to the conversation from a place of respect and kindness, and feel free to use the chat both to pose questions or provide information for others relevant later on. I am going to put right now a link to the Gathering website in the chat in case you need to access the agenda there. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sam.
Thanks, Lydia. Hello, crew. Thanks for showing up to this virtual workshop, webinar, whatever we're going to call this. I hope lunch was good. This is usually the time that it's that post-lunch bump at the gathering that most of us usually try not to nap through. So I'm going to try to keep you awake. Hopefully you've already had lots of coffee and are just ready to roll through this one. This is going to be a somewhat interactive, or an attempt at an interactive sort of working session where ultimately we're going to try to get, there are a lot of people on this call who have more experience than I do and have a lot of insight, and so hopefully we can make this as interactive as possible. There'll be parts of the agenda where you'll probably want to turn your cameras on and maybe even your microphones and hopefully speak up, because I'm gonna sort of run through things, but I'm not the expert on this one. And I hope to have a lot of you chime in with some of your expertise. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sam Smith. I am the Farm Business Director at the Intervale Center, based in Burlington, Vermont, speaking out of my secret office in an undisclosed location, as most of us are. Let's see, my primary role is to do business planning with farmers, and I now tend to do a lot more transition planning than just the sort of rote business planning and enterprise analysis that we normally associate with business planning. And so that's part of the reason that I'm in the driver's seat today, is just having the experience of working with multi-generational farm transfers around the state, And there are a number of other people on this call who also have that expertise. So I'm going to switch over to our PowerPoint here. We're going to do just in terms of agenda, and we'll go back through this once the PowerPoint's up, but I'm just going to present the briefs that relate to this topic, and there's going to be a lot of words in the PowerPoint. I apologize for that. We're trying to get through a huge amount of content in a relatively short amount of time. That's probably going to last about a half hour with some clarifying questions at the end. Feel free to put any questions in the chat box as we're going, and I can address those as well. Then we're going to do a group discussion. We'll see how that goes with the large group, but hopefully people will be willing to chime in and sort of talk about the various briefs. And then we're going to take a break so you can go out and have another cup of coffee. And then we're going to come back and we'll break out into group discussions. And those will last for about 40 minutes. And then we'll come back together for some closing sort of comments around those group discussions. This format is really similar to the ones that we did in person at the gathering in past years. So, you know, we'll see how it goes, but I hope everybody gets something out of it today. And so I'm going to start up my PowerPoint now and we'll go from there. All right, so, you know, just some general guidelines around speaking here. We are, you know, the goal is to speak from your perspective, really add what your perspective is to the conversation. Like I said, we have a bunch of people here that have a lot of experience in this area. We're all here. It's a learning environment. We want to really make sure that people feel free to speak their mind. And then really just respecting people. Hopefully we don't have a lot of interruptions on Zoom, but it's possible. So, but these are just the general guidelines. So for us, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the farm to plate context, sort of the way that these briefs were developed and the overall plan. And then I'm going to spend the majority of my time just talking about the briefs that inform this topic of succession, which is why we're all here today. So that, you know, the briefs that we're going to spend our time in, I have done a relatively good job of trying to condense those briefs into sort of as basic a format as I can, so that we can move forward and have a discussion about the priorities, and then ultimately, hopefully, have a conversation about informing the process and priorities moving forward, because the briefs really are a point in time and a gathering of information, and hopefully this group can start to put those priorities in a ranking, and then sort of think about how we're going to move this forward as a group. I think a lot of us have seen over the last 6 to 8 months the groundwork that was laid through the original farm to plate plan, and all the work we've done over the last 10 years really come to fruition in a way that we really couldn't have imagined it when our local food system was really called upon, and we were able to meet a lot of the challenges that were put in front of us in a way that I think other areas were not. So to talk about the plan development, many of you were engaged in it, but this, you know, the briefs that informed this topic were primarily developed this past fall, and usually though they were the result of sort of topic matter experts coming together, developing out recommendations and points of information within a structured context. They were then reviewed by more sort of experts in each of the areas, And then today is the opportunity for people to provide feedback for those briefs. So hopefully people have gotten a chance to look at them. There was a link at the beginning of the agenda, which people, if you don't have them up, I would encourage you to pull them up. And I'll talk about the ones that we're going to address as part of this topic. But those briefs really represent a condensed version of these huge topic areas. And just to give you an example, one of the briefs that I provided input on was the finance brief, and we were trying to whittle it down into basically a 2-page brief, and it was 13 pages in its first draft. So there, it's a lot of information going into it, and then going into a format that is accessible to members of the general public, practitioners, and then also policymakers. And I think, so really thinking about all the different audiences that those were put together for, and then also the fact that they're put together to help inform the work that we all do as a group moving forward. So today we're going to work on sort of thinking about this set of briefs, putting together some of our recommendations, and then those will be sort of integrated into the Farm to Plate strategic plan, which will be sort of the marching orders for this whole group and the ag sector hopefully for the next 10 years. We are at a sort of odd place to do this, as is evidenced by this format, but I think that we can get a lot done today. So there were a number of briefs that really touched on the topic of succession. We had one specific brief that really was based around farm transfer and succession that Ella Chapin was the lead author on, and then a number of us contributed on. And I'm going to go through just each of these, or some of these briefs, not all of them, and then talk about some of the recommendations within them, and then we'll go into our conversation. So what the briefs that we had that informed this conversation are succession, supporting future farmers, farmland conservation, land use planning, which is one that I didn't really include so much in the slide deck, but I think is definitely part of the conversation. And those are some complex issues that really impact the type of land that's accessible, and then also really indicate some of the pressures that are being placed on agricultural land, access to capital, business and technical assistance, and then alternative ownership models. And I do want to point back at the plenary panel there. Like Amber and Naomi really talked about one of the things, like when we talk about alternative ownership models, I think that they're sort of on the forefront of a movement that we would hopefully see more of. And I also think what Andrew was saying about sort of his trials and tribulations around finding the right type of land and the right type of farmers to support his business also plays into this succession conversation. So I think they really teed it off with some great content and sort of case studies that we could have put together as part of this. So I'm just going to go through these as quickly as I can. I have a ton of content. So succession, we have a huge challenge facing us here in the state. We have a really rapidly aging farm population. As you can see from the numbers here, the majority of our farmers are over 65 and do not have a succession plan in place. So, a lot of those farmers are operating either marginally profitable farms, or in the case of small to mid-scale dairies, unprofitable farms at this point. And even in my short time doing transfer planning with farmers, the model has shifted where it used to be a relatively straightforward process to help a dairy farm transition from one generation to the next. And that's no longer, I haven't done one of those in 4 years now. So And then, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but new farm businesses don't really necessarily fit the land or infrastructure. Andrew's example is a really great example. He ended up in a relatively large conventional freestall barn, and he happened to have a business that really could use a lot of that space, but he really had to diversify and think about how to utilize that infrastructure. And we see that in terms of the land base too. He's talking about a type of agriculture that would use a lot of land, but the majority of the new and diversified farmers we see actually only utilize a relatively small portion of the land base sometimes for their business model. And they have to figure out how to either scale up or diversify. So we do see in our work as business planners a lot of young, enthusiastic farmers out there. So that is, a trend that has not changed over time. And I think actually in the past 6 months, we've seen an uptick in people who are interested in farming and people who are also interested in farming in Vermont. I think we have a really appealing climate. We have a nice land base, and our social and environmental values tend to attract farmers. There are a lot of challenges facing young farmers. So access to markets, capital, and lack of a replicable agricultural model can be challenging. And so what it really requires is that we see younger farmers moving towards needing to be more holistic in terms of being business people first and then farmers second. And I think that that's a point that this group can hopefully discuss and how we support that. So farmland conservation is another issue that has a really profound impact on farm succession. We have seen a lot of really successful farm conservation efforts in the state of Vermont over the past 40 years. And those efforts are continuing. We're seeing some challenges in terms of the funding associated with that. But hopefully that's just a blip and we can continue to improve that. We've also seen some changes in the way conservation is approached. And I think it is a sort of dynamic situation in terms of what types of easements are placed on farms, and then sort of how, especially when we come to things like sort of collaborative farming models or the newer beginning farmer business models, that the conservation process needs to be shifted or amended to facilitate some of that. So we are on the forefront, I think, of the business and technical assistance movement. A number of us, the practitioners of business planning in the state, went out to Minnesota last year right around this time and participated in a national farm viability conference. And every time we go to one of those, it really shows how well we're doing in the state. I think as part of the process of thinking through this brief in particular, it did highlight, we're doing really good work in terms of providing supports to farmers around business development. I think what the brief highlighted was that we have some challenges in terms of the type of support we're providing, especially things like transfer transition planning, which require a really high level of sophistication that we need to have professional development opportunities for business planners, and that there needs to be sort of more targeted support as we see these emerging business models. And you'll see some of this in the recommendations section, but I think this is an area where this group could definitely contribute in terms of thinking about or talking about what the needs are and how those needs are best met. This is one of the ways that I really like to think about the way we're providing technical assistance in the state. And so if you're looking at this slide, you're thinking about providing services through the entire spectrum of business development. And I actually like to think of this more as a circle instead of a flat sort of linear diagram. I think that ideally the mature business would just wrap around and go back into the pre-venture or startup business. And we do see that, and we're seeing more of that where we have established businesses that are selling their farm to their farmer ag business to a young or beginning farmer. So access to capital is another huge concern in terms of farm transfer. We see a lot of newer beginning farmers that are having challenges accessing capital, either for operations or for farm purchase. Some of this has to do with just the fact that the business models they're proposing are not familiar to capital providers. And then some of it has to do with the fact that the farmers are undercapitalized to begin with or lack equity. And I think this also goes back to that discussion around equity, especially as it relates to BIPAC communities or underserved communities, in that they may not have the historical like community equity or family equity that allows them to have a balance sheet that supports a farm purchase. So, you know, that access to capital is just a really interesting conversation as it relates to the ways that we can help farms transfer and new and beginning farmers develop their businesses. And then we also, well, I think Amber and Naomi's presentation really talked about this in a great way, where I think we as a group and in the agricultural sector really need to think about how we're looking at land use as well. I think the generation of new and beginning farmers now has a very different set of values and considerations when it comes to land. And it provides a real opportunity to think about the structure of land ownership and land usage. And so I think that's another part of this topic, especially when it relates to land that does not necessarily align with the agricultural models that are going to be profitable in this sort of new and developing economy. So if a vegetable farm, if a vegetable farmer is buying a farm that has 100 acres, is only going to use 5 acres of it, how do you use that other 95 acres? And can you do that? Can you collaborate with other farmers? And then if so, you know, the issues of housing and equity and the structure of ownership all come into play. So, but I think those are also opportunities for really thinking about how we can support farmers and how we can develop farms in this new ag economy. So I'm just going to check and see if anybody, I don't see any questions in there. We will get a chance for questions in just a second. So recommendations, I didn't put these in any order. A lot of them came out of the different briefs, but a lot of them were very redundant when I got into the actual crafting of this. And so, you know, a lot of it came down to funding, and I actually took out the majority of the recommendations that had specific dollar amounts or FTEs, because I think that that's part of this group, is to really think about, I think it sort of broadens us back out again enough to really look at what the recommendations are, and then think about how we can really address these issues. You know, I'm not unbiased in this because my position is funded through the Farm Viability Program, but I also think that we do really good work. And I think that VHCB has done a really great job over the last 30 years of advocating for the conservation of land, the development of our rural communities and rural downtowns. And then the Farm Viability Program has had a really good return on investment in terms of supporting farm businesses as they grow. So another topic that you're going to see here in the recommendations is really around the development of the tools for already conserved properties. And this is one that we should talk about. You'll see a couple more in the recommendations around how to be creative in terms of helping farmers essentially own land or have long-term land tenure that allows them to grow the businesses that they want to grow. So going along with funding though, there is definitely a need for professional development for TA providers. I think this goes for financial business providers, but also for technical assistance providers who, like UVM extension specialists who work with, I think Chris Callahan is a great example of someone who has really taken a specialization in ag engineering and really moved it into a level that has a huge level of utility for farmers. I was on one of their webinars last week for the Veg and Berry Growers Association around pack sheds. He and Andy, and it was just amazing. The amount of information in an hour, and how many mistakes farmers could avoid, and then how much they could implement in a really simple and cost-effective way. It was just really cool to see. And then I think one of the things that we've seen success is really encouraging peer-to-peer networking and learning opportunities for farmers. We see that a lot in things like the pasture walks that the grass farmers put on. We've actually done some new and beginning farmers socials that have been really successful, completely unstructured. We provide dinner and beer, and they sit and talk for like 2.5 hours, and it's really great. And they just talk about their common experience, which is something that they may have done at the Grange, 70 to 100 years ago, but we don't have the Grange anymore. So hopefully, maybe we'll have the Granges back when we're allowed to socialize in groups again. So this is, these recommendations, some of these we've already started to implement. So we have great sort of business plan resources out there. The Farm Viability Program has business planning resources. We have business planning resources at the Intervale Center for beginning farmers. And then we have, there's a Farm to Plate indicators task force that has been talking a lot about benchmarking and really thinking about how we can provide resources for farmers within the state to start to really understand the financial and production performance of their farms and businesses with the other ones that surround them. So, the dairy industry has been really good at doing this for a really long time, and we just don't see it in these emerging businesses. So that's an area that we'd like to see potential growth and development. And then the land trusts. So, really thinking about models for getting farmers on land. The land trust has the Farmland Futures Fund, which is, they're raising 15 million to sort of put towards this buy, lease, sell model, which allows farmers to get on farmland without having to purchase it, and then be able to grow their business there and stabilize before they have to access financing for the final purchase. Market development is one that I think is probably more reflected in some of the other briefs, but I think is one that plays into this conversation. If we don't have adequate markets for our next generation of farmers, then they're not going to be successful in their businesses. And then, I think education and advocacy, especially for policymakers, but also for other different sort of elements within the structure that we all operate in, is really important as well. An example of this is really, we tend to do quite a bit of education when it comes to sort of lenders and working with farmers and lenders to be able to sort of educate around how that business model is going to work on that specific farm. And I think as we see these new business models, everybody's sort of learning all at once. Like I would definitely point to the hemp CBD market as one where we're all sort of learning at the same speed. And the goal is to try and get everybody familiarized so that we can provide services and hopefully have people access capital and create stabilized long-term viable businesses. These were some cool ones out of the finance brief, which I would really encourage. I would encourage you to read all of these briefs, but this one in particular, I had a great time working on it. And I think that Janice St. Ange, who was the lead author, did a really amazing job of thinking through where the financing need is within the ag sector and really how to make it more accessible to new and beginning farmers. So I definitely paired some of the recommendations out of this, but there were some really cool ones around, like we were talking about needing to have finance mechanisms for land access, and the Agricultural Loan Loss Reserve Fund is kind of a cool idea around creating, that's my cat in the background, around creating a mechanism so that farmers don't have to have a huge amount of equity to be able to purchase that property, and that maybe there's a down payment that stays with the property if they decide to leave. I think also the concept of bringing in slow capital and investors from around the region, people are really excited to invest in what they see as cool and creative projects that really have a sort of more values-based, potentially lower return. But like a great example of that would be the current push for the Agrarian Trust model in South Burlington at Bread and Butter Farm, which is, you know, a way to make that land accessible to the farmers without the really, you know, the high cost of overhead on that land, or the cost of capital on that land. And then I also thought that this bottom point was really cool too. And just thinking about how do we support farmers who come out, especially if they come out with student loan debt, how do we support them in a way that, like, the same way that there was student loan forgiveness programs for teachers, and sort of acknowledging that farming and agricultural is really, it's not only a vocation, but it's a social good as well, because they're providing a product that we consume. So the other areas, like thinking about how we're going to support these new and developing business models. I think really thinking about if they're going to be diversified, how we're going to research them and then really promote and develop the financial models around it. And then I think just really thinking about the alternative models that we could utilize to get people on land without them necessarily having to own it. Like I'll go back to the Agrarian Trust one again, where you know, that's potentially a nonprofit holding that land in perpetuity, but allowing the farmers to access it with no concern around land tenure. All right, that was a lot of information in a really short amount of time. I'm gonna exit this. Take a breath, let people turn back on their camera. I'm gonna grab Ruth over here. She's gonna join us for the question portion of this. Okay. So let's see, who's got a question over there? No questions. Okay, I can keep talking then. Oh.
Sam, I think maybe you need to bring the kitty to the future gatherings in person too. Maybe this should be a new theme where we have.
She would love that. She's a
gathering with
critter.
pets.
She's actually she's angry because I shut the door. And she really wants to be outside. So I'm gonna actually let her out. And then
Anybody have a cow or a goat in their office space?
I left the goats at home. I'm sorry.
Go. All right. So I do see that note from Eric about the ag loan loss reserve fund concept, which I think is a really cool concept. And I think we borrowed from something like the model that's used for affordable housing, where essentially there's a intentional development of affordable housing stock, and then that those units are made available at a sort of subsidized market rate, but then the equity stays in it so that the balance sheet looks better for the bank, and there's less concern about them having to have a certain amount of collateral in the property. So what existing resources, or what resources exist that might connect future farmers to potential retiring farmers today? So we manage a site called Vermont Land Link, which is a listing and linking site. And people can list agricultural properties on there free of charge. And then we have farm seekers are also capable of, they can create a profile, but the majority of them just sign up for a service that will send them an email anytime a new property is posted, or a weekly digest with new properties. And then there's a messaging function on the back end of the Vermont Land Link site. And so they can connect up. And we have had a pretty decent amount of success in people finding properties that way. So we've had a lot of I will have to say we've seen a significant uptick in activity this year in particular. And then we have seen some recent successes, like the Land Trust was brought in on a property in this last year, and they closed about a month ago. That was a property that the young couple located on Vermont Land Link. How does this work intersect with the need to advance Indigenous land sovereignty? I think once again, this comes back to the conversation around like alternative land structures, and really thinking about one of the things that really struck me in the presentation in the plenary session that Amber and Naomi talked about is that we have a huge amount of underutilized land in this state. And one of the trends that we're seeing as part of some of that activity on Vermont Land Link, but just our interaction with non-farming landowners overall, is that we're seeing an increase in interest from wealthy non-farming landowners who are interested in buying land in the state and then collaborating with a farmer. And I don't think that that directly addresses the concern in your question there, but I think that I think it's something that we need to talk about as a community, is that doesn't seem like a mechanism to sort of address equity in land ownership and land usage. So, but I think overall models like the Agrarian Trust would be a great way to sort of think about that, and think about lands more as a common resource as opposed to just a mechanism for people to accumulate wealth and then maintain wealth. And I'm happy if other people want to chime in to talk about these questions, that is fine with me as well.
Can I jump in there, Sam?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ella Chapin. I run the Vermont Farm and Forest Viability Program, if you don't already know me, at the Housing and Conservation Board. And, I know Maggie and others that are involved in some of the things I'll mention are on here too. But I think it's maybe just worth a few minutes to talk a little bit about equity and diversity and BIPOC community efforts. And I don't know if anybody from the BIPOC community is on this and could speak to more directly, but I just wanted to mention that we're seeing some really exciting projects percolate, both around sort of access to land and land ownership by BIPOC communities in the agricultural sector, but also transitioning and working on programming within the sort of viability space, business assistance programs, technical assistance programs that are better designed and either BIPOC led or designed with help from Indigenous and African American community members to be culturally appropriate resources. And I think there's a lot of work to do there, even though we have substantial, really invested a lot in Vermont from like, capital, access to capital resources, access to business assistance resources, access to land resources. We do a lot of really great things and have a really strong foundation. It is all white led, and it is, really in need of an overhaul in some ways. Not that we would lose all the great programming we have, but that it's time to rethink a lot of how that's designed. And so I just wanted to mention that, there's a partnership with NOFA Vermont and NEFOC, New England Farmers of Color Land Trust, and the Vermont Land Trust that we've been supporting, that both sort of provides direct services at the same time as working in partnership across those three organizations to look at the design of programs and how they might be redesigned to be more inclusive. We've started thinking about at our level sort of everything from how we use the word farmer and versus farm worker, and maybe we really need to rethink that language. We're looking at our eligibility requirements that were sort of intended to weed out sort of hobbyists and people who aren't necessarily really focused on their business, but realizing that there's unintended consequences of weeding out people who just don't have the background and access to wealth and opportunity to, move out of that sort of farm worker space to farm management and farm ownership. So, I think that there's just a lot going on. I just wanted to seed that and just share that. And then also on the conservation side, and I think we're going to need, back to Sam's comment, I think we're going to need many models on the sort of conservation and land access side that does everything from sort of community ownership that doesn't necessarily support a lot of wealth generation to, land ownership models for folks.
This is Eric. Since we're here and we have all these super smart people, it might be worth seeing if it's possible to dive in a little bit on the hardest, thorniest aspects of what we're now talking about. Like if you look at Regina's question around aspiring farmers and being well prepared as managers and business people, and if you look at Ollie's question around intersecting with the need to advance Indigenous land sovereignty, and if you think about Amber's response during the plenary about a nonprofit business model with a fiscal sponsor of a very, very well-resourced foundation, and I think there's probably many answers, and it might be helpful to just surface a range of them, particularly if there are BIPOC folks on the call that want to add either from direct experience or what they know in terms of models. But what are, is an expectation that a foundation will finance the ownership of land in perpetuity? And this is why I kind of asked Sam about the Agrarian Trust model to say a little bit more about it. And then there's some relationship that, for example, a BIPOC or Indigenous person would have with that land, and then how is that protected, and what are the covenants between, if you're decoupling ownership and sovereignty, like how does that really work? And then are expectations of the farm business and business management taken completely off the table? Like if you're doing education and you're philanthropically funding the production of food and giving the food away, how does that work over time? And is there a risk that if a model doesn't pan out, then there's clawbacks on the back end for whoever is managing whatever the financial relationship with that owner structure is. And, you know, so what are the models on the front end and what are the risks on the back end of the different models and how are they protected against in the covenants?
I want to address Fran's question and then we can go into that, Eric, but or not Fran's, whoever was requesting more information. And I'm going to just take a poke at the Agrarian Trust model, and Fran, you can sort of correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially what the Agrarian Trust model is it's essentially a mechanism for community fundraising where essentially funders put money into the purchase of a property that is then housed in a separate entity that is a nonprofit, and then a farmer is allowed long-term tenure on that property and is responsible for the overhead costs, but not the costs of capital on the property. So not responsible for paying the interest associated with, let's just say, if it's a $500,000 property, 5% interest on that property per year. And what it does is it decouples the financial burden of ownership from the usage of that land. And it also allows that farmer to develop a business that could potentially be transferred, but it allows them to dedicate their capital to the development of their business and not to really become super highly leveraged and incapable of raising more capital to develop the business, which is what we see with a lot of new and beginning farmers, is that even if they come to the table with quite a bit of capital, they end up being sort of challenged as they are looking for operating funds to grow their businesses, because the majority of their money ends up being tied up in the land and infrastructure of their farm. So I think that's pretty close to the Agrarian Trust model. But I think that, you know, we have like sort of a hybrid model at the Intervale where we own some of the land. There are private landowners that own some of the land, and then the farmers essentially rent the land, but there are sort of shared services and the access to markets are good. And I think that that's the type of thing where we don't have a great replicable model yet, which hopefully the Agrarian Trust model will be something that is successful and then could be replicated across the states to allow farmers to access land without having to have a really significant amounts of capital just to be able to buy the land base.
Sam, just to add, you can hear me?
Yep.
So the Agrarian Trust is a nonprofit that has formed 10 agrarian commons across the country. And one of them is in Vermont. And it's the community that will own, quote unquote, some of us believe land isn't really owned, but for our purposes here, it's a community land trust that owns the land. And then the farmers whose businesses are on the land will have, as you said, long-term tenure, 99-year leases to be able to, so they don't have to spend, as you said, any capital, any money on the land debt or the land cost, but it all goes into the land.
Yeah. And Fran, I saw that you did put up another question there around easements and amendment of easements, and I'm going to kick that one to Maggie, because I do think that this is a huge question that we need to address. It's directly related to this sort of larger land use question, but our current system of conservation easements does not allow for a huge amount of flexibility, and some of that is related to the federal funding that the majority of those conservation easements are purchased using. But I do think that it needs to be a conversation as we move forward in terms of how do we best meet the needs of farmers. One of the things that I didn't really talk about relating to the briefs, but is a huge issue when it relates to farm succession and new and beginning farmers accessing land, is that once an agricultural easement has been placed on a farm, it's really difficult for farmers to develop housing or other infrastructure because the conservation easement immediately devalues that or reduces the value of that improvement, and makes it so that those farmers really, for the most part, are unable to access the capital to do something like build a house. So if there's let's just say if there's a couple 100-acre parcel with no existing house on it, but there is a house site, the farmer may not even be able to build that house because they can't access the capital to be able to finance it, or to finance that build, because the end value of the house will be at agricultural value, which can be anywhere from 25 to 40% of the build price.
Before Maggie jumps in on this topic, can I just briefly introduce Stacy Sibula, who's our new agricultural director at the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, taking over for Nancy Everhart, who's been around for 20 years doing this work. So you'll see her comments in the chat already, and I just wanted to make sure folks know that she's our new ag director.
Thank you. Appreciate you calling me out, Ella. And yeah, I made some comments in the chat box, but go ahead, Maggie, if you want to take this question, I can fill in the blanks if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time in my role like designing easements, and but I think we think a lot, I think a lot about, I think first and foremost, like being transparent with farm seekers up front about like what an easement will mean, and really digging into their vision and their plans. And I think it's easy for farm seekers to just sort of see a conservation easement as like money and as the way to access a property for less, without really thinking about the long-term implications of what it's going to mean for building in the future, or constructing like a processing facility. And so part of my goal is to I don't come from the conservation world. And so it's really to demystify that process for farm seekers. Cause I've sort of had to demystify it for myself. And so I think that's a really important part of it. And I think that the other piece is we're very aware of that, and aware of thinking about what are some other tools and some systems that we can use to, if one of our goals, conservation is a goal, perpetual affordability is potentially also a goal. And so what are some other, conservation doesn't always necessarily mean perpetual affordability. Those things have sometimes gone together, but they're not necessarily directly connected. And so can we look at the affordable housing model? Can we look at a shared equity model where it's really about keeping the land perpetually affordable within, and certain restrictions, as opposed to using conservation to try to do that. So I think one thing that's come out of our partnership with, working with the Northeast Farmers of Color and NOFA is just the understanding of what types of businesses farmers of color generally want to have in the Northeast. And NEFOC has seen that through surveys, through developing this network. And it's generally farms that are smaller, that have a strong community component, that are very agroecologically focused, very diverse in what they want to do, and many times involve I think Amber and Naomi's vision speaks, is very representative of what we've seen in a lot of folks in terms of what they want to do. So just being really forthcoming with people about, here's what an easement means. And if this isn't going to fit with your vision, then let's try to figure out another pathway to get to what you want, and not try to use this tool for something that it's not meant to be used for. And I think Stacy brings up a couple of important sort of more technical points in her notes around subdivision and you know, the challenge in revising an old easement. So I think it's about trying to get creative in new easements moving forward. Where the last thing I'll say is just we're involved in the Bread and Butter project in South Burlington. That, you know, that's a conservation project, and there was some creativity that went into those easements. And so I think, you know, having these conversations and thinking about, is there a way we can have, you know, housing owned separately from land, or, but we have to think about it on the front end.
If I could jump in here, I think there's a little nuance here that hasn't really been discussed with these previous easements. There's really no reason why a group of farmers can't access a previously conserved farm together. They can form a cooperative, an LLC, even work through Agrarian Trust, and then have leases to divide up the land. I think where the issues start to come in is in infrastructure ownership and housing ownership and the amount of housing that's available. But I don't think that in of itself, the previous easements are preventing multiple parties. And there's actually a number of examples out there of previous easements where multiple farmers are utilizing a larger piece of land. And so I think it's more nuanced than whether or not you can just access, multiple people could access a previously conserved farm. And I think that to the housing issue too, the numbers that I've been looking at is very often it's difficult. And I think particularly if you were trying to build something this year where building material costs have gone up tremendously, except in the highest housing demand sections of the state, like Chittenden County, it's actually very hard to build a house for lower than the resale value. It's costing you significantly more to build the house than its immediate resale value would be. So there's some lost equity potential even without a conservation easement. And I also want to point out, we've gotten onto this conversation about land access specifically, but as we talk about succession in farms, it's not just about the land, but it's also about the business and business assets. And all farmers, beginner farmers that are starting out, not only need access to land, but access to capital, access to the technical information, access to markets. So most of the things that Sam covered. And so we could be working to provide land to people, but if we don't also address the needs of the next generation farmers in those other arenas, they're not going to be prepared to be able to be involved in succession. And I think particularly as we've tried to provide those resources in Vermont, and now we're looking and saying, well, we still are in need of more successors to come in to take advantage of some of the farming opportunities that are out there. We need to figure out where the disconnects are to where those people are needing to access those resources to really be prepared to access them. And most especially farmers of color, who we also have to think about how are we recruiting them and in general connecting with them, because I think that's one of the big issue here is that we're not even making those connections. And while we're a very white state, we have a lot of white farmers that are finding their way to Vermont. How do we help farmers of color find their way to Vermont to be the successors for farmers that don't have successors?
Thanks, Mike. Along those same lines, Regina had put in a comment a little while back, and it really is, her question, she was sort of talking about the emotional aspects of farm transitions. And I think that's something that's not really addressed in these briefs as much as it could be, or probably should be. And it's actually the point that usually is one of the primary concerns relating to the transfer of farms, primarily because farmers really, you know, farming is their job, but it's also, you know, it's a lifestyle and it's ties them to the land. And usually the emotional aspects of farm transfer can be some of the most difficult to address and then work through. I've had more transfers fail as a result of issues relating to the emotional aspects of it than in those relating to management or markets or finances or even ownership of the land. But she also made, her question was really around how are we making sure that they're prepared as managers and business people. And I think this is one of the questions that we should talk about in our breakout sessions, and is really something that we focus on in our business planning work, is really how do we build the management capacity of these new and beginning farmers. We've talked almost exclusively, as Mike was pointing out, around the structural elements that we need to promote these transitions. But I think there's also the elements of knowledge transfer and management capacity, which are really at the root of business viability and the long-term success of those farm businesses. If they don't have a viable business, they're not going to be able to be there in the long run. And that's what we see with, you know, conventional dairy farms. There are still young people who want to get into the business of milking cows on a small level, small to mid-scale level, and it's just not, the economics of it don't work at this point. So I'm going to look down. There's a couple more. So it looks like we have sort of a good starting point here. We're going to take a 15-minute break, 13-minute break, and get back here right at 4. And then we'll just have a sort of, we have a few framing questions for our group breakouts, and then we're going to break out into smaller groups, and then we are going to be in those groups for about 40 minutes. So that'll give us a chance to really dive in and talk about some of these issues and concerns. I would encourage you in that 15 minutes, if you haven't already, to look at the briefs that were mentioned at the beginning and really look at some of the bottlenecks and recommendations that are on there, because that's really what we're going to dig into in these small groups. So I would say everybody go get some coffee or water or Halloween candy if there's any of that left over, and we'll be back shortly. All right, crew, I think we'll start back up. Hopefully people will join us, and then if they don't, they're gonna get booted through cyberspace into small groups. So that is their, that'll just be their experience. So I am having a little bit of technical difficulty, but what I'm gonna do, so the goal with these breakout sessions is to really think about the context provided by the briefs. I'm going to put 3 framing questions up here on the PowerPoint, and I'll just, let me just see here. There we go. Not there. There we go. So we're going to break out into small groups. It's up to, they're just going to be randomly assigned. And my request is that we use these 3 framing questions for the conversation in the group, and that we have a volunteer in each group to just take notes about what the discussion touches on in the group. And then if you could send those notes to Lydia, who will put her contact info in the chat. That way they can be collected and utilized in sort of crafting the plan. So the 3 questions are what stands out as the most urgent to start addressing in the next 1, 3, 5 years. And COVID has obviously impacted the way we're going to address that question. And I think, the long-term plan, thinking about 10 years and beyond, is really important as well. I think we really, that's one of the benefits of having this time and space together, is that we can think about where we want to see our state in 10+ years, and then help to think about the supports and policy and structure that will hopefully allow that new reality to manifest over time. And I think we've seen that as the results of the last farm to plate planning process 10 years ago. And then this goes back to the actual briefs themselves, sort of thinking about the bottlenecks or gaps and what might be missing in terms of recommendations. So once again, these were relatively small groups that crafted these briefs, and I think that they are, so there's a limited experience there, and I think this group could hopefully expand that experience. So with that being said, I'm gonna kick us back out here. We're gonna have about 40 minutes in these breakouts, and then we'll just circle back right at the end for like 10 minutes of just takeaways. Hopefully each group can report back some of what they discussed, and then we'll head off to Jake's closing comments. So.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and open the breakout rooms.
Thanks, Leah.
Yep. So Mary Ellen, you might have to click join to get bumped to your room.
All right, crew. Hopefully we have everybody back in here. And that was a fun and exciting opportunity to talk with other people. Hopefully nobody else got lost out there. Is Mary Ellen? Oh, Mary Ellen's still lost. Oh, there she is. Hey, Mary Ellen, you made it. So hopefully that was productive time for people. I would love to just go around and have a brief report out, like 3 minutes for each group. We're going to wrap up right at 5. So
Sam, just real quickly, we actually need to close just a few minutes before 5 so that I can hop off and start the next call.
Oh, okay. Lydia's like the grand controller of all things Zoom. So
this is the only power in my life.
Lydia, how many groups were there?
There were 4.
4 groups. Okay, so 2.5 minutes each. Who is group number 1? If you know, when you were like doing this, it said you were group number 1. Anybody?
I think we were group number 1.
All right. Regina, do you feel like reporting back?
I am going to do my best as I was scribbling, so my group can catch anything that we missed. One of the things that I think we all have as a baseline is an understanding that there's an aging population, not only here in Vermont on farms, but all over the region, that's something that's going to be an issue all across. And so I know where I want to go with our biggest pieces, but I think one of the things that came up is that the decisions made and the transfers made in the next number of years is going to impact us far into the future. That it's going to be important to provide tools for new farmers, not only because of the existing age of farmers, but also the different levels of expertise that people have who are coming onto farms. Graham mentioned that land speculation from investment firms is something that's become an issue here in the state. So being aware of that and seeing if there's ways to coordinate to counteract that corporate investment in ways that might encourage other different alternative business models or structures to get people onto land is going to be really important. And then we spent a chunk of time talking about how much we like the idea of the loan guarantee program, the alternative, having somebody else actually own the land and infrastructure and allowing more focus for finances to be able to go into the farm business, or the loan forgiveness. One person in our group noted that even those who are investing here in the state of Vermont need to have a guarantor when they're doing loans, if they're able to advance money. And there was a comment that came up that for a lot of people who come, that the equitable access for those without inherited wealth, that it would be a really advantageous thing to be able to offer, is to be able to offer access to money and loans and a guarantor for people who don't necessarily come from inherited wealth with the ability to provide that themselves. So very positive ideas around alternative situations for people to access money, have loan guarantees, and also much more a recommendation too around, for the business and technical assistance brief, to have training also around alternative models, that I think there might be more familiarity with more traditional transfers of land, but looking at more training around alternative models to help people who are looking at different ways to get onto land.
Cool.
And that's kind of my stammering report. If anybody has anything to add from my group.
All right. Group 2, Andy Wood, is that you? Were you the note taker? I saw you hold up 2 fingers.
He was letting me know.
Oh, Betsy, that was 2 fingers. You're right above him on my screen, so you were pointing up to Betsy.
No,
okay.
he was just saying we're number 2 because I had no idea what we were. And Regina, that was a fantastic report. I'm feeling a little panicked, but we focused a lot on the business and technical assistance side of the briefs, and there was a real strong discussion around the entrepreneurs that it takes to really be successful, and that you invest in individuals. So we just went into a lot of the different things about how does that individual farmers seek out assistance? What does that mean about the farmer who's getting assistance? And one point was that the language that we often use, technical assistance, can be very off-putting to some farmers will think, what does that even really mean? Is that you're going to come fix my computer? Or, the other piece that can happen with technical assistance is that it helps them in that moment, but does it strengthen them over the course of their whole lifetime as an entrepreneur? The other piece that we thought that came up that's very important to emphasize, maybe, is is the professional development needs for the coaching and business assistance, that we need to find ways to raise that up so that people are getting trained in this field and really have the support they need, so that we have more technical assistance for entrepreneurs. We did talk about the shift that we're going to see in the future. So we had quite a lengthy conversation around small dairy and large dairy and succession planning there. We didn't get as much into the bigger succession questions that Regina brought up. But when we were talking about what's missing, one point that came up towards the end of the conversation is just this need for more concerted research to understand what the consumer needs are. That it's kind of trying to balance vision. So what is the vision for how we see Vermont's agricultural future being versus what is the true need? So kind of balancing that out. Another point was, does tech solve a problem, or does it show us what we need and then we go for it? So that there's a tension there in terms of, I don't know if you can compare ag to tech at all, but so I'm trying to think. I have like 4 or 5 pages of notes, so I know I missed some stuff there, but those were high points.
All right, cool. We're whizzing through. I am note taker for group number 3, and I'm going to go quickly here because we got to get Leah out the door. So we, the first thing that came out, and I think it's both an urgent and a long-term important concern, is really addressing the issues of equity relating to farm ownership and land ownership and farmland access. And you know, the primary means of addressing that is really connecting with these communities and bringing them into the room in the first place so that they can help inform the conversation around where we're going. We also had concern around non-farming landowners and the land that they own and allow access to, and the increasing trend in people coming in and buying more land up. We talked about the long-term community needs and really the sort of development of the next generation of farmers, and we got into talking about apprenticeships and sort of federally recognized apprenticeship programs and how those are an important mechanism for building up the sort of farmer base. And I'm going to leave it at that. And who's number 4? No number 4.
A bunch of us are.
How about a quick, we have 2 minutes.
Maggie, you want to give it a shot?
Maggie, 2 minutes.
Oh, I wasn't prepared to do this.
Hard.
Yeah, a lot of our focus was around sort of alternative business models and thinking about how do we really like start when working with people and thinking about like what are their values around like wealth and around wealth generation, and like what is the business model that's going to help them get to that point, and starting from there in order to determine like a sort of model for ownership and access that makes sense. And some of the questions that sort of came out of it for us to address are like a better understanding. Like we just talked about how so much of wealth generation in agriculture is around land appreciation. And so if you take that out of the mix with some of these, like potentially take it out of the mix with alternative land ownership models, then like what are other forms of wealth generation that we can gain a better understanding of outside of land ownership? And yeah, really digging in with people around like, what does wealth mean to them and what are their goals around that? I don't know, we had a really good conversation. It's hard for me to like summarize it. Eric, I'm sure you have some things to add.
That was awesome. We could also stop.
Yeah, I think we have to wrap. That's perfect, Maggie. We're going to get Lydia out of here on time to make the magic happen. I just want to thank everybody for being really engaged in this. This is a really tough format for me. I think it's a tough format for a lot of people. And I do miss, like, we're not going to be able to play ping pong or drink at the bar tonight or eat a good meal. And that's unfortunate because I've done that with a lot of people on this screen for the last 10 years. And so I find that sad, but I really think that I want to thank you all for just engaging in this conversation, thinking about this going forward, and joining us for the rest of this gathering. So thanks, everybody. Give yourselves a hand.
Thanks all. And I put the link to the next session in the chat if you need
There
it.
we
It's
go.
also in the agenda.
All right.